This story is titled, My Wife Made Everyone Laugh at Me During the Party and Only Later Realized She Had Hurt Me So Badly That I Left and Would Never Return. Hey Reddit, my name is Jason, and I'm 29 years old. I work as a marketing coordinator for a mid-sized company here in Tampa, where I've been living with my wife of 4 years. From the outside, our life seemed pretty solid. We had our routines, our shared spaces, and what I thought was a good thing going. Looking back now, I realize how much I was just going through the motions, assuming everything was fine because nothing was obviously broken. That Tuesday started like any other day, except I managed to get off work early. It wasn't planned, just one of those rare afternoons where everything aligned and my boss told me to head out. I didn't think to text my wife to let her know I was coming home early. Why would I? It was my house too, and I figured she'd be happy to see me sooner than expected. No calls, no warnings, just the quiet anticipation of surprising her with some unexpected time together. Instead of pulling into our driveway like I normally would, I decided to park down the street. I'm not sure why I made that choice. Maybe some subconscious part of me already sensed something was off. Or maybe I just wanted to walk a bit and enjoy the afternoon. The neighborhood was dead quiet, the kind of stillness that feels almost staged. The only sounds breaking the silence were a sprinkler clicking rhythmically across someone's lawn and the distant hum of a leaf blower somewhere down the block. The heat hit me immediately as I stepped out of the car. It was that thick, humid Tampa heat that presses against your skin like a wet blanket, making every breath feel heavy. But there was something else in the air that day. Something about that silence felt deliberate, like a movie scene waiting for its cue. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into something, though I had no idea what. As I approached our house, I noticed the living room was empty and the TV was off. Her sandals were by the door, those strappy ones she always complained about, saying they pinched her feet but wearing them anyway because she thought they looked good. The bills were scattered across the counter, nothing unusual there. Everything looked normal, perfectly ordinary. But then I heard it. Music drifting down from upstairs. Soft, smooth jazz. Her chill playlist, the one she used to put on during our Saturday mornings when we'd drink coffee together and argue about whatever stupid reality show was on. I remember those Saturday mornings now like they belonged to strangers. Two people who existed in some parallel universe where things were simple and honest. The music brought back those memories with painful clarity, and I found myself standing in our living room, listening to the soundtrack of what used to be our happiness echoing through the house. I made my way upstairs without making a sound, my feet finding the familiar spots on each step that wouldn't creak. Halfway up the staircase, I heard something that stopped me cold. Her laugh. It was a low, private laugh, the kind she used to save exclusively for me during our intimate moments together. The sound bounced off the walls like some damn echo from our past, when that laugh meant something entirely different. I stood there frozen on the stairs, not moving a muscle, just listening to that laugh that I knew so well, but had rarely heard lately. My hand instinctively tightened around the banister as a terrible realization began to creep into my consciousness. I think that's when I already knew what I was going to find, even before I saw anything with my own eyes, before any words were exchanged or explanations demanded. Some deep, intuitive part of me had been preparing for this moment without me ever consciously admitting it to myself. The bedroom door wasn't even fully closed, just slightly ajar, as if privacy wasn't really a concern. And there she was. Brianna was sitting casually on the edge of our bed, her hair pulled up in that effortless way that always made me think she looked beautiful. Her skin had that particular glow it gets when she's really trying to look good for someone, when she's put thought and effort into her appearance. She was wearing a tank top I didn't recognize, something tight enough to showcase everything she knew would catch a man's attention, something deliberately chosen for effect. Across from her, leaning against our dresser like he owned the place, was him. Kevin stood there with his arms crossed, wearing this smirk like he'd just won some kind of prize, like he was savoring a victory I didn't even know we were competing for. The casual confidence in his posture, the way he seemed so completely comfortable in my bedroom, made my stomach turn. Then she dropped her fork. Not because she noticed me standing there in the doorway, but because the tray of Chinese takeout they were sharing between them tipped over when I finally pushed the door open without bothering to knock. They had been eating together, sharing a meal in my bedroom like they were on some kind of intimate lunch date. The whole scene froze like someone had hit pause on a movie, and I found myself staring at a tableau that would be burned into my memory forever. The whole scene remained frozen like a paused movie for what felt like an eternity. Brianna's eyes finally landed on me, and the look she gave me wasn't one of shame or panic. It was more like I had just ruined her favorite song by walking in at the wrong moment. Kevin didn't even flinch at my sudden appearance. He just stood there with his arms still crossed, that smug little grin slowly sliding off his face as he realized the husband had finally entered the picture. "I didn't know you were home early," she said, her voice flat and matter-of-fact. It's not what it looks like. Not, let me explain what's happening here. Not even a hint of the panic or embarrassment you'd expect from someone caught in such a compromising situation. Just that simple statement, delivered cold and flat. Like I was the one who had made some kind of mistake by walking into my own bedroom in my own damn house. And then the strangest thing happened. She laughed again. It was short and sharp this time, like she genuinely couldn't believe that I was the one interrupting her moment. "Guess it's a little awkward now," she added with a casual shrug, reaching for a napkin like nothing was burning down around us. Like this was just some minor social inconvenience rather than the destruction of our marriage. I didn't say anything at first. Not while she calmly picked up the container of General Tso's chicken that had spilled. Not while Kevin slowly walked past me toward the door, moving like I was completely invisible. Like this entire situation didn't deserve even a single word of explanation or acknowledgement. The audacity of it was breathtaking. He brushed right by me as if I were a piece of furniture, as if my presence in my own home was merely an inconvenience to be navigated around. What struck me most was that Brianna didn't even follow him out. She just sat there on the edge of our bed, still chewing her food, still staring at me with that same detached expression. And then, as if the situation couldn't get any more surreal, she looked me directly in the eye and asked, "Well, are you going to be dramatic about this?" That was the first moment when I realized something far worse than betrayal was happening here. She didn't feel guilty, not at all. There wasn't a trace of remorse or shame in her voice, no indication that she understood the magnitude of what I had just walked in on. She was treating this like I had overreacted to finding her watching TV with a friend, not discovering her in an intimate situation with another man in our bedroom. I didn't leave the room right away. Instead, I stood there in the exact same spot, like some idiot statue carved out of pure disbelief. She wiped her fingers methodically with a napkin, still chewing like she'd just earned a damn prize for getting caught red-handed and managing to stay completely calm about it. There was no flinching, no tears, no desperate attempts at explanation. She didn't offer a single apology or show even the slightest hint of regret for what I had just witnessed. Instead, she looked me dead in the eye with that cold, calculating stare and said, "I told you things were off. You just didn't listen." That's what she led with. Not even 5 minutes after I had walked in on her, and Kevin eating lunch like they were on some romantic date in our bedroom, and she was already pushing the blame squarely in my direction. It was as if I had missed some critical signpost along the way that clearly stated, "Your wife is about to throw your life off a cliff." And my failure to read the signs made this entire situation my fault. I think I said her name just once, quietly, like maybe if I said it with the right tone, she would suddenly snap out of whatever trance she was in and realize the enormity of what was happening. "Brianna," I said, barely above a whisper. She rolled her eyes at me like I'd forgotten my line in some play she had already rehearsed in her head countless times. "You're making this a bigger deal than it needs to be," she said with that weird, unsettling calmness in her voice. "We haven't connected in months. You knew that." Her voice had this chilly, detached quality to it. The same tone she used when she was arguing with customer service representatives over the phone. That professional coldness that treated me like I was just another inconvenience she needed to manage, rather than her husband, who had just discovered her infidelity. Without really thinking about it, I sat down in the armchair across from the bed. The room still carried the scent of her perfume, some vanilla-laced fragrance that used to make me think of home and comfort. Now that same smell made me want to throw open every window in the house and scream until my lungs gave out. The familiar had become foreign. The comforting had become suffocating. "You're sleeping with him?" I asked, though it came out more like a cough, flat, small, and pathetic. She didn't deny it, didn't even hesitate for a moment to consider her response. "Yeah," she said, with the same casual tone she might use to admit she had bought a new coffee maker without telling me. "I am." That was it. No elaboration, no context, no attempt to soften the blow. And then she crossed her legs and added, as if she was sharing some profound romantic revelation, "Honestly, I feel more myself with him than I have with you in over a year." That line about feeling more herself. I don't think I'll ever forget exactly how she said it. Like it was some beautiful epiphany she had experienced. Like I had been nothing more than a leash around her neck, and Kevin was the damn key to her freedom. I laughed. I didn't mean to. It just burst out of me, dry and bitter, like something had cracked inside my chest. She looked at me like I had completely lost my mind. Her eyebrows raised in that condescending way that suggested I was being unreasonable. "You're proud of this?" I asked, my voice barely controlled. "You think this makes you what, free?" She didn't answer immediately, just stared at me with that blank expression that I was beginning to realize had become her default whenever she didn't want to engage with the reality of what she had done. Instead of responding to my question, she simply got up from the bed, grabbed the empty takeout container with deliberate casualness, and said over her shoulder as she headed toward the door, "If you're going to mope, can you at least not do it in here? This energy is exhausting. This energy is exhausting." Those words hit me like a physical blow. Here I was, trying to process the fact that my wife had been having an affair, and she was treating my emotional response like it was some kind of inconvenience she shouldn't have to deal with. She walked out of the room before I could formulate any kind of response, leaving me sitting there in stunned silence. I remained in that chair for over an hour, just listening to her moving around in the kitchen below. She was humming while she cleaned up, actually humming, like none of this mattered, like nothing significant had just happened, like I hadn't just watched everything we had built together dissolve in real time right there on our bed. The casual normalcy of it was almost more devastating than the affair itself. She had become a complete stranger to me, and the worst part was that I couldn't pinpoint exactly when that transformation had occurred. When had the woman I married turned into someone who could compartmentalize betrayal so effortlessly? When had she developed this ability to treat our marriage like it was just another item on her to-do list that she could check off and move on from? That night, I didn't even attempt to sleep. I couldn't bring myself to lie down in a bed that felt contaminated by what I had witnessed. Instead, I just sat in the living room, staring at the spot where her sandals had been earlier that day. She had moved them at some point, just casually picked them up and tucked them away, like somehow organizing the physical space would erase what had happened. Like neatness could somehow cover up the betrayal that had taken place upstairs. Around midnight, she walked downstairs wearing one of my old t-shirts. The nerve of it struck me immediately. After everything that had happened, she was still casually wearing my clothes like nothing had changed between us. She looked at me sitting there on the couch and gave this half sigh, like I was the one making things unnecessarily complicated. Like my presence in the living room was somehow an overreaction to what she had put me through. "You're not even going to say anything?" she asked, her tone suggesting that my silence was somehow more problematic than her infidelity. I didn't look at her directly, couldn't bring myself to meet her eyes. "You said it all already," I muttered, my voice barely audible. She walked into the kitchen with that same casual confidence, opened the refrigerator, and grabbed herself a drink. I watched her movements from the corner of my eye, noting how utterly fluid and unaffected they were. There was no hesitation, no shame in her posture, no indication that she felt any discomfort about the situation we found ourselves in. She moved through our shared space like she owned it completely, like she had every right to be comfortable while I sat there drowning in the wreckage of our marriage. She came back into the living room and sat across from me, settling into the chair like we were just two roommates having a casual discussion about dividing up the utilities. When she finally spoke, her voice was slow and deliberate, like she was carefully explaining something to a child who wasn't quite bright enough to understand the situation. "I know this is hard," she said, each word measured and patronizing, "but I need you to stop acting like a victim." A victim. That word hit me like a physical blow, cracking something deep inside my chest that I didn't even know was still whole. The casual way she said it, like my pain was just some kind of performance I was putting on for attention, made me finally look up and meet her eyes. "You cheated," I said, the words coming out harder than I intended. "You brought another man into our home. You lied for God knows how long. And I'm the problem here?" The questions poured out of me, each one carrying months of confusion and hurt that I was only now able to articulate. But she was ready with her response, like she had been preparing this argument for weeks. "You stopped seeing me," she said with conviction, "long before Kevin ever touched me. You stopped looking at me like I was something you wanted. I tried to tell you, but you just kept pretending everything was fine." Her words were delivered with the confidence of someone who genuinely believed she was the wronged party in this situation. I stood up slowly, not out of anger, but because I needed air, needed space, needed to move before the weight of this conversation crushed me completely. But before I could step past her, she delivered one more devastating line. And Kevin, he listens. He makes me feel like I'm not invisible. There it was, the full performance, the complete justification script that she had undoubtedly rehearsed. Maybe she had practiced it in the mirror, or maybe she had whispered it to herself while lying in bed next to me as I slept like an oblivious fool, never suspecting that she was mentally preparing her defense for the day I would inevitably discover her betrayal. "I was always here," I said, my voice growing stronger as the reality of the situation became clearer. "Every night, every morning, I gave you everything I had and none of it mattered." The words came out raw and honest, carrying the weight of all those months when I had tried so hard to be a good husband without realizing she had already checked out of our marriage. She snapped then, her carefully constructed calm finally cracking. "Because you stopped trying!" she shot back, her voice rising for the first time since this whole nightmare began. "You think showing up is the same as showing love? That's lazy! You got lazy!" But even in her anger, she wasn't emotional. She was just cruel and cold, like someone methodically pulling weeds from a garden rather than dismantling a life we had built together. And then, as if this was the final word she needed to win some imaginary argument that had been playing out in her head for months, she looked me straight in the eye and delivered the most devastating blow of all. "You should have seen this coming." That's when I left the house. I didn't grab shoes, didn't take my phone, didn't even think about what I might need. I just walked out the front door and down the street, past the same sprinkler that had been spinning earlier when I thought I was coming home to a normal evening with my wife. The night air felt different on my skin. Cooler, cleaner somehow. My chest felt heavy, weighed down by the enormity of what had just happened. But strangely, my head was quiet for the first time in months. There was no more pretending, no more making excuses for her distant moods, her unexplained absences, the growing silence that had settled between us like a thick fog. It was all true now, all of it laid bare and undeniable. And the worst part, the detail that would haunt me long after the pain had faded, was that she had meant every single word she said. This wasn't a moment of weakness or a mistake she regretted. This was her truth, carefully considered and deliberately chosen. She had looked at our marriage, weighed it against whatever she had with Kevin, and decided that what we had wasn't worth fighting for. The clarity was brutal, but necessary. As I walked through the empty streets, I realized that the woman I had married was gone, replaced by someone who could rationalize betrayal as self-discovery and treat her husband's pain as an inconvenience. The grief I felt wasn't just for the end of our marriage, it was for the person I thought I knew, who had apparently never existed in the first place. I ended up at my brother's place without really planning to go there. Derek didn't ask any questions when I knocked on his door at that late hour. He just opened it, took one look at my face and said, "She did it, didn't she?" I nodded once. That was all I had in me at that moment. All the confirmation I could manage to give. He didn't push for details or demand explanations. He simply handed me a beer, pointed toward the guest room, and let me collapse in silence. Sometimes the best kind of support is just the absence of questions, and Derek understood that instinctively. He gave me the space I needed to process what had happened without forcing me to relive it through storytelling. I don't remember actually sleeping that night. I think I just blinked through the hours, lying on the guest bed and watching the ceiling change from dark to gray to the pale light of morning. I kept replaying her voice in my head like a broken record stuck on the most painful track. "You should have seen this coming." The words echoed endlessly, each repetition cutting a little deeper. What tore at me most wasn't just the betrayal itself. It was her complete lack of remorse. There had been no apology, no regret, no moment of panic when I discovered them together. She hadn't fought for our marriage or begged for forgiveness. She hadn't even hesitated when confronted with what she had done. When I caught her with Kevin, it was like she had been waiting for that moment, like she had been anticipating the discovery so she could finally drop the mask and stop pretending to care about what we had built together. The realization that she had been performing our marriage for months, maybe even years, was almost more devastating than the affair itself. How long had she been going through the motions? How many nights had she lain next to me, planning her exit strategy while I slept beside her, completely unaware that our relationship was already over in her mind? The next day, she sent me a text message that perfectly encapsulated her approach to the entire situation. "Let me know when you're ready to talk like adults." like adults, as if I had thrown some kind of childish tantrum by walking out after discovering my wife with another man. As if catching your spouse in your own home, in your own bed, didn't warrant anything more than a mature, reasonable discussion about logistics. I didn't answer the text. Not then, not while the wound was still so fresh and raw. Instead, I started pulling at the threads of our relationship, quietly investigating the signs I had apparently missed. I called our bank to check the account statements, looking for patterns I had been too trusting to notice before. What I found in our bank statements was a pattern of deception that had been hiding in plain sight. There were several charges I didn't recognize scattered throughout the past few months. Hotel reservations that neither of us had mentioned, Lyft rides she had never told me about, dinners at restaurants we had never eaten at together. Each individual charge seemed innocent enough. But when I looked at them collectively, they painted a clear picture of a double life she had been carefully constructing. I opened her shared calendar next, something I had never felt the need to scrutinize before, because I had trusted her completely. She had marked late meetings at least 7 times over the last 2 months, each one conveniently scheduled on evenings when she came home later than usual, with vague explanations about work obligations. Every single one of those alleged late meetings coincided perfectly with a charge that appeared under Kevin's name on our credit card statements. The methodical nature of her deception was staggering. She wasn't just slipping into something new on impulse. She had already built an entire alternate life around her relationship with Kevin. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment or a mistake she had stumbled into. This was a carefully planned campaign of lies that had been going on for months while I remained completely oblivious. I called a lawyer that afternoon, just for a consultation, just to understand what the hell my options were in this situation. The woman on the phone had a voice that was steady and practiced, the tone of someone who had guided many people through this exact scenario. "Do you have any evidence of infidelity?" she asked in a professional, matter-of-fact way. I laughed. Too loud, too sudden, the sound bursting out of me before I could control it. "Yeah," I said, my voice carrying a bitter edge. I walked in on it. The words felt surreal, even as I spoke them, like I was describing someone else's nightmare rather than my own lived experience. How do you explain to a stranger that you discovered your spouse's affair in the most cinematically brutal way possible? That evening, Derek and I sat on his porch with beers, the familiar ritual of brothers who didn't need to fill every silence with words. He didn't press me for details about what had happened, didn't demand that I relive the trauma by recounting every painful moment. After we had been sitting quietly for a while, he finally asked the question I knew was coming. "Are you going to try and fix it?" I didn't answer right away. I thought about her face when I had confronted her. That blank, unmoved expression that showed no trace of remorse or regret. I thought about how methodically she had cleaned up the spilled Chinese food, how casually she had defended Kevin like he was her soulmate rather than the man who had helped destroy my marriage. I thought about that t-shirt of mine she had worn downstairs, stretched across her back while she rationalized her betrayal. "No," I said finally, the word coming out with more certainty than I had expected. "There's nothing to fix." And as I spoke those words, that truth settled over me like a heavy blanket. Not comfortable exactly, but warm in its finality. The marriage had been over long before I walked into that bedroom. I was just the last person to realize it. 2 days passed in relative silence before I finally decided to respond to her messages. I hadn't planned to reach out at all, but apparently my lack of communication had gotten under her skin in a way that her betrayal hadn't affected her conscience. I woke up to a string of increasingly demanding text messages from her, each one revealing more of her true character than she probably intended. "We need to have a real conversation," the first one read. Then, "You can't just ghost me. It's childish." Followed by, "Ignoring me won't change the fact that we're married." And finally, the one that showed her hand completely. "Fine. If you want to make this ugly, we can." There it was, the shift from fake concern to barely veiled threats. Just like that, without any transition period, she had moved from pretending to care about our relationship to making it clear that she was prepared for war. It was textbook Brianna behavior, really. If she couldn't control the emotional tone of the situation, she would try to control the narrative instead. So I texted her back with a simple message. "Meet me at the house at 6 o'clock. Alone." I didn't tell Derek where I was going or what I planned to do. I didn't need a witness for what I already knew had to happen, and I didn't want anyone else to see what our marriage had become. When I arrived at the house, I opened all the windows throughout the entire place. I'm not sure why I felt compelled to do that. Maybe to let something toxic out. Or maybe to let in air that I could actually breathe without feeling suffocated. The house had felt stagnant and oppressive since the discovery, like the walls themselves were holding onto the tension and deception that had been festering there. She arrived exactly on time. Of course she did. Her hair was perfect, her makeup flawlessly applied, showing not a single sign that she had been losing any sleep over the destruction of our marriage. She walked through the front door like she still owned everything in sight. The space, the emotional dynamic, the upper hand in whatever conversation was about to unfold. "I wasn't sure you'd have the guts to face me," she said as she tossed her purse onto the table with casual confidence. I didn't take the bait, didn't rise to meet her attempt to provoke me into an emotional reaction that she could then use against me. "Sit," I said, my voice calm and controlled. She didn't like that tone. I could tell by the way her jaw twitched slightly, the first crack in her composed facade. But she sat anyway, settling into the chair like she was graciously indulging me, like this was a meeting she had already planned to dominate. "I talked to a lawyer," I said without any preamble, watching her reaction carefully. Her eyes narrowed immediately, and I could see the calculation happening behind them as she processed what this meant for her. "You're serious about this," she said, and there was something in her voice that wasn't quite surprise, more like she was recalibrating her approach to the situation. "You made it serious," I replied, keeping my tone steady and factual. Then I reached into the manila envelope I had prepared and handed it to her. Inside were copies of all the evidence I had gathered, the hotel receipts, the Lyft transaction logs, screenshots of her calendar entries, and even some messages between her and Kevin that I had found on our shared cloud account. She flipped through the papers slowly, her expression barely changing as she reviewed the documentation of her own deception. When she finished, she tossed the envelope back onto the table between us like it was nothing more than junk mail, completely dismissing the evidence of months of calculated lies. "You really went full stalker, huh?" she said, folding her arms defensively. Even confronted with irrefutable proof of her betrayal, she was trying to make me the villain in this story, trying to paint my discovery of her lies as somehow more problematic than the lies themselves. I leaned forward slightly, my voice remaining calm but carrying more weight. "No, Brianna. I went full husband, the one you swore loyalty to while you were planning lunch dates in my bed." The words came out measured and deliberate, each one chosen to cut through her attempts at deflection and get to the heart of what she had actually done. Her lips twitched into this half-smile that made my stomach turn. It wasn't nervous or ashamed. It was smug, like she was enjoying some private joke that I wasn't in on. "You think being a victim gets you something here," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "You think this makes you noble?" "No," I said, standing up slowly so I could look down at her. "It just makes me done." The finality in my voice seemed to catch her off guard, and for the first time since I had walked in on her with Kevin, I saw something shift in her expression. We sat in complete silence for what felt like a full minute, with nothing but the sound of wind gently moving the curtains I had opened, and her breathing gradually becoming more shallow and agitated. The silence stretched between us, heavy with the weight of everything that had been said and everything that could never be unsaid. Then she stood up abruptly, her composure finally beginning to crack. "So what? You want me to leave now?" she demanded, her voice rising slightly. "Just pack a bag and vanish? Is that what this little scene is supposed to accomplish?" "No," I said, standing up to meet her at eye level. "You can stay here tonight. I'll go back to Derek's, but tomorrow you're out. I've got paperwork started, and you'll be served by the end of the week." The words came out with a clarity and conviction that surprised even me. There was no anger in my voice, no emotional outburst, just the calm delivery of facts that had already been decided. She laughed then, but it was cold and forced, the kind of laugh that people use when they're trying to convince themselves that they're still in control of a situation that's rapidly spiraling away from them. "You're really doing this," she said, and I could hear the disbelief creeping into her voice for the first time since this whole nightmare had begun. "I already did," I replied simply. The truth of that statement hung in the air between us like a verdict that couldn't be appealed. She looked at me for a long second, and for the first time since I had discovered her with Kevin, something in her eyes actually cracked. It wasn't guilt or sorrow. Those emotions seemed to be beyond her capacity at this point. It was surprise, pure and simple. She genuinely hadn't expected me to follow through with this. She had been so confident that she had broken me down to the point where I would beg her to stay, where I would accept whatever scraps of affection she was willing to throw my way. But now she was beginning to realize the truth that I had come to understand over the past few days. The man she had betrayed hadn't shattered under the weight of her deception. Instead, he had woken up. He had seen her clearly for perhaps the first time in their entire relationship, and what he saw wasn't someone worth fighting for. She didn't cry. She didn't scream or throw things or make any of the dramatic gestures I might have expected from someone whose marriage was ending. She just stood there looking stunned, blinking rapidly like she was trying to load a response that wouldn't come. Her mouth was slightly open, as if words were supposed to emerge, but her brain couldn't quite formulate them. I picked up my keys from the table where I had set them, gave her one final look that contained everything I needed to say, and walked toward the door. There was no slamming, no dramatic exit, no parting shots designed to hurt her the way she had hurt me. I simply left, denying her even the satisfaction of a big emotional scene that she could later twist into another manipulation. Back at Derek's, I lay on the guest bed staring at the ceiling once again. But this time the experience felt fundamentally different. The pain was still there, deep, sharp, and gnawing at my chest. But beneath it, something steadier was beginning to form. Yes, there was anger, but more than that, there was a growing sense of clarity, like I had been underwater for months and had just now finally broken through to the surface. Brianna didn't reach out to me the next day. Not to apologize, not to plead for another chance. Nothing at all. The silence should have been a relief, but instead it felt ominous, like the calm before a storm I knew was coming. Then, instead of a phone call or text message, I received an email from her that stripped away any remaining illusions I might have had about the woman I had married. The email was brutally simple. Just a single sentence with no subject line, no salutation, no attempt at civility. If you want this to stay clean, you better think twice about involving a lawyer. It was pure venom distilled into one threatening line, and it told me everything I needed to know about how she planned to handle our divorce. This was her strategy now. She was moving fast, switching gears from seduction to intimidation without missing a beat. The woman I had married, the one who used to laugh at my stupid jokes and curl up next to me on Sunday mornings, had been completely replaced by someone I didn't recognize. This new version of Brianna was someone who saw love as a contract she could break without consequences. Someone who cared more about maintaining control than preserving any vestige of the connection we had once shared. I forwarded her threatening email to my attorney immediately. If she wanted to play hardball, I was prepared to meet her on that field, but I wasn't going to do it without proper legal representation. Later that same day, I decided to stop by the house, not to talk to her, but to start gathering my personal belongings before things got any uglier. I sent her a brief message giving her notice that I would be there for about an hour to collect some of my things. She didn't respond to the text, but when I arrived, the house was mercifully empty. Good. I didn't need another confrontation, and I especially didn't need to see her face while I was trying to salvage what remained of my life. I walked through every room slowly, taking my time not because I was feeling sentimental, but because I was carefully measuring what I was actually leaving behind. There were photos still hanging on the walls, memories of better times that now felt like artifacts from someone else's life. Our wedding picture was still tucked into the corner of the bookshelf, showing her face beaming with joy and mine wide open and stupid with love. Looking at that photograph, I realized that guy in the picture had no idea what was coming. He had no conception that the woman standing next to him in her white dress would someday twist every vow they had made into leverage against him. He couldn't have imagined that the person promising to love and honor him would eventually treat their marriage like a business transaction she could dissolve whenever it became inconvenient. When I opened our bedroom closet to gather my clothes, I discovered that half of my belongings had already been unceremoniously shoved into trash bags. Not carefully packed, shoved. My shirts were wrinkled, my shoes were loose and scattered, my ties were balled up like garbage. She hadn't even tried to hide her contempt for me or for the remnants of our shared life. One of the trash bags still had a sticky note attached to the top, written in her handwriting with that casual cruelty that had become her signature style. "Didn't know what you wanted," it read. Figured this was the important stuff. She had underlined the word important, like it was some kind of joke. Like the rest of my life, and belongings were completely disposable, unworthy of even basic consideration. The note was a perfect encapsulation of how she had come to view me. Not as a person with feelings and needs, but as an inconvenience she needed to clear out of her space as efficiently as possible. Even in the simple act of packing my clothes, she couldn't resist one final dig, one last attempt to make me feel small and unwanted. I took everything anyway, loading all the wrinkled shirts and scattered shoes into my car trunk without ceremony. I shut the door firmly and walked away without giving the house a single backward glance. There was nothing left there that belonged to me anymore. Nothing worth looking back at or mourning. Later that evening, she finally called. I watched my phone ring and let it go to voicemail. Then she tried again immediately, displaying the kind of persistence that suggested she was getting increasingly frustrated with my refusal to engage with her on her terms. I let that call go to voicemail as well. Instead of leaving a message, she sent a text that perfectly captured her mindset. We're going to need to talk eventually. Don't act like you're some kind of saint now. Even in her attempt to re-establish contact, she couldn't resist taking a shot at me, couldn't simply ask for a conversation without also trying to tear me down in the process. And that message was the final click for me. The last illusion falling away completely. This wasn't a person I could reason with anymore. Maybe she never had been someone I could truly communicate with, and I was just now seeing her clearly for the first time. The love between us had been dead long before Kevin ever walked into our lives. I had just been the last one to accept that reality and finally bury what was left. The divorce papers went out the following week, served to her at her workplace as my attorney had recommended. It wasn't done out of spite or a desire for revenge. It was simply the cleanest, most straightforward way to handle the legal proceedings. Still, I couldn't help but picture her face when it happened. That flash of humiliation she wouldn't be able to control in front of the very colleagues she had been smiling with, flirting with, and lying to about the state of her marriage. I didn't want revenge, didn't need it to feel whole again. But I won't pretend that the thought of her public embarrassment didn't feel like a small crack of justice in a situation where justice had been in short supply. She had spent months building lies and maintaining facades. Now she would have to deal with the consequences of those choices in the most public way possible. She didn't reply to the divorce papers that day, maintaining the same cold silence she had perfected since our confrontation. But 2 nights later, at exactly 11:42 p.m., she showed up at Derek's front door. I heard the knock before Derek did. There was something about the rhythm of it that I recognized immediately. Some familiar pattern that told me exactly who was standing on the other side of the door. I opened it to find her standing there in a hoodie with no makeup, her hair pulled back in a deliberately casual way. She was trying to look small and vulnerable, attempting to weaponize the kind of helpless appearance that might have worked on me months ago when I still believed in the person I thought she was. "I just want to talk," she said quietly, her voice pitched to sound wounded and sincere. I didn't move from the doorway, didn't invite her in, or give her any indication that this performance was having the desired effect. Derek stood up behind me, clearly ready to intervene if necessary, but I gave him a look that said I could handle this. It was fine. I needed to face this conversation eventually, and it might as well be now when I was feeling strong and clear-headed, rather than waiting for a moment when I might be more vulnerable to her manipulations. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me, creating a physical barrier between this conversation and the safe space Derek had provided for me. She stood on the porch with her arms crossed like she was cold, even though it was a warm 75-degree evening without even a hint of a breeze. She didn't speak at first, just stared at me like she was waiting for me to melt back into the compliant, forgiving husband she had taken for granted for so long. But I didn't budge, didn't offer her any opening to slip back into the dynamic where she controlled the narrative, and I scrambled to keep up with her emotional manipulations. "I didn't think you'd actually go through with it," she finally said, and there was genuine bewilderment in her voice. Of course, she hadn't expected me to follow through. She had been so confident in her assessment of my character, so certain that she had worn me down to the point where I would accept whatever terms she offered, rather than face the uncertainty of life without her. "Of course you didn't," I said simply, letting the weight of that truth settle between us. She looked away for a moment, then back at me, and when she spoke again, her voice seemed to break slightly, though whether the emotion was real or calculated, I could no longer tell. "I didn't want it to end like this," she said, trying to inject some vulnerability into her tone. But I had heard too many of her performances by now to be moved by what might have been genuine regret, or might have been just another attempt to regain control of the situation. "Then you shouldn't have ended it like that," I replied, my voice steady and matter-of-fact. The simplicity of that truth hung in the air between us, cutting through whatever narrative she was trying to construct about how we had arrived at this point. Her eyes flashed for a second, just a brief moment where I could see her real reaction, the anger and frustration at not being able to manipulate the situation back under her control. But she caught herself quickly, pulling the mask of vulnerability back over her features before continuing with her performance. "I was confused, lonely," she said, stepping slightly closer to me. I didn't move backward, but I didn't meet her advance either. "I needed something you weren't giving me." It was the same justification she had used before, the same script she had rehearsed to explain away her months of deception and betrayal. "You had a husband," I said simply. "You needed honesty. You chose deceit." The words came out clean and direct, without any of the emotional charge she was probably hoping to provoke. I had moved past the stage where her excuses could hurt me. Now they just sounded like exactly what they were. Hollow attempts to avoid responsibility for her choices. She stepped forward again, trying to close the physical distance between us, as if proximity could somehow bridge the emotional chasm her actions had created. "I know I hurt you, but don't pretend you were perfect either," she said, her voice taking on a sharper edge. "You checked out a long time ago." I laughed. Just once, short and hard, the sound cutting through the night air. "Checking out isn't betrayal," I said, looking directly into her eyes. "It's exhaustion. What you did was treason." That hit her. I saw it land, saw her face tighten as the word treason registered. It was the right word, and we both knew it. This hadn't been a mistake or a moment of weakness. It had been a calculated campaign against our marriage, a deliberate choice to undermine everything we had built together while pretending to maintain the facade of being a loving wife. Instead of backing down or acknowledging the truth of what I had said, she shifted tactics once again. "I didn't mean for it to get that far," she said, her voice taking on a pleading quality. "Kevin, it wasn't serious." "Then why are there 4 different hotel receipts under his name?" I asked quietly, my voice calm but carrying the weight of all the evidence I had uncovered. The question hung in the air between us, and for the first time in this entire conversation, she didn't have an immediate response ready. The silence stretched on for several long seconds. I waited, giving her the opportunity to explain away the documented proof of her extended affair, but no explanation came. She couldn't spin hotel receipts into innocent meetings or casual encounters. Finally, I leaned closer, my voice low and controlled. "Tell me one thing," I said. "Were you still planning to leave me if I hadn't walked in that day?" It was the question that had been eating at me since I discovered them together. Whether this had been building toward an honest conversation, or whether she had been planning to maintain the deception indefinitely. Her eyes dropped to the ground, and when she finally answered, her voice was barely audible. "No," she whispered. And with that single word, the full scope of her betrayal became crystal clear. And there it was. The truth that was somehow even more devastating than the affair itself. She hadn't been planning to leave me at all. She was going to keep both me and Kevin lying to my face every single day while maintaining her double life indefinitely. She would have continued pretending to be my loving wife while sneaking around with him, using me as her safety net while pursuing her passion elsewhere. I nodded slowly, letting that revelation settle in my mind. "You know what that makes you, Brianna?" I asked, my voice quiet, but carrying the weight of absolute certainty. She looked up at me, and I could see in her eyes that she knew exactly what was coming. "It makes you worse than a cheater," I said, each word deliberate and final. "It makes you a coward." That was when she finally cried. Not because of guilt or genuine remorse for what she had done to our marriage, but because her control over the situation was completely gone. She was crying because I had seen through every manipulation, every excuse, every attempt to rewrite history in her favor. She was crying because I hadn't yelled or begged or given her any of the dramatic reactions she could have later used to make herself feel better about her choices. Most of all, she was crying because I didn't fold. Despite everything she had put me through, despite the months of lies and deception, despite walking in on her with another man in our bedroom, I was still standing there with clarity and dignity intact. She had expected to break me, and instead, she had lost all power over me. I stepped back toward Derek's front door, my hand already reaching for the handle. "This is done," I said with finality. "You don't get to rewrite the ending." Those words carried the weight of every conversation we would never have, every apology she would never make, every chance she had already squandered. And with that, I left her standing there on the porch in the darkness, alone with nothing but the echo of her own choices ringing in her ears. I didn't look back, didn't give her the satisfaction of seeing any lingering doubt or pain in my eyes. I simply walked away from the wreckage of our marriage and closed the door behind me. She didn't call again after that night. For the first time since this entire nightmare had begun, the silence between us wasn't loaded with unspoken tension or unresolved conflict. It was final, complete, and absolute. And that finality felt like oxygen, pure, clean air that I could finally breathe without the weight of her deception pressing down on my chest. But peace didn't mean numbness. It meant I could finally feel things clearly without second-guessing every emotion or wondering if I was overreacting to her behavior. The grief was still there, but it was clean grief now, uncomplicated by the confusion and self-doubt that had been clouding my judgment for months. Every corner of my life, every object in that house had once been tied to her memory and our shared experiences. But now, even those memories felt like old receipts from a store that had shut down years ago, artifacts from a business that no longer existed, reminders of transactions that had been canceled and voided. She tried one final move the following week. I received a package with no return address, but her handwriting on the shipping label was unmistakable. Inside was a shoebox filled with old photographs, pictures of us on vacation, smiling with beers on the beach, goofy selfies from the early years when everything felt effortless and genuine, love notes written in hurried handwriting during boring office meetings when we still found each other interesting enough to interrupt our workdays. And there was one letter, not typed but handwritten on that same stationery she used to keep by her side of the bed. It wasn't really an apology, not in any meaningful sense. It was more like a summary of our relationship, like she was trying to give the whole thing a neat, tidy ending that would somehow make sense of everything that had happened. "I don't expect forgiveness," the letter began. "I just want you to know I did love you once. The real kind. The kind that makes your stomach flip and your world stretch in ways you never thought possible. But somewhere along the way, I started disappearing in this version of us, losing myself in the routine and expectations of what we had become. And when Kevin came along, it wasn't really about him specifically. It was about remembering what it felt like to be seen, to be wanted, to feel alive in my own skin again." The letter continued. "I'm sorry you got hurt in the fallout of my choices, but I don't regret waking up." That last line stopped me cold. She was calling her betrayal a waking up, as if her affair had been some kind of spiritual awakening rather than a devastating breach of trust that had destroyed our marriage. I didn't respond to the letter. I didn't call her or write back or acknowledge the package in any way. Instead, I threw the whole box into my closet and closed the door firmly. Not out of rage or spite, but out of complete disinterest. That chapter of my life was over, finished, closed. I didn't need her version of closure or her attempt to reframe our story in a way that made her feel better about her choices. The legal paperwork came back signed without any additional drama or attempts at negotiation. The divorce became official through a series of mundane administrative steps. The division of property, the final signature on documents, the last dull meeting with lawyers to finalize details that felt more like settling a business dispute than ending a marriage. With every step in that process, I felt lighter, like I was shedding a weight I had been carrying for so long that I had forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. Each signed document, each transferred asset, each severed legal connection was another step toward freedom from the prison of lies and manipulation that our marriage had become. I went back to the house one last time, just me alone, to walk through the space that had once been our home. The place was completely stripped bare now, walls echoing with emptiness, rooms devoid of the furniture and belongings that had once made it feel alive. There was no more hidden tension lingering in the air, no more unspoken resentment crackling between the walls. Just stillness, pure and simple. As I moved through each room, I found her wedding dress still hanging in the hall closet, carefully wrapped in plastic like some kind of shrine to a marriage that had died long before the divorce papers were signed. I stared at it for a moment, that pristine white gown that had once represented hope and promise and forever. Now it looked like a costume from a play I had never really understood, even while I was performing in it. I left the dress exactly where it was. Let the real estate agent deal with it when they came to prepare the house for sale. Let her memory haunt this place if it wanted to. It wouldn't be haunting me anymore. I was done carrying the ghosts of what we used to be, done preserving the artifacts of a love that had apparently been one-sided for longer than I cared to calculate. I moved out of state shortly after that final visit. Not far, just enough distance to feel like the air belonged to me again, like I could breathe without inhaling the residual toxicity of everything that had happened. I found a small apartment on the edge of a quiet town, near a trailhead and a lake where I could walk and think and remember what it felt like to exist without constantly bracing for the next emotional ambush. The apartment had clean walls and empty drawers, spaces that had never been contaminated by lies or filled with the accumulated debris of a failing relationship. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I had to steel myself every time I walked through my own front door. There was no tension waiting for me, no careful navigation required around someone else's unpredictable moods and hidden resentments. People asked what had happened, of course. The co-workers who noticed I had stopped wearing my wedding ring, the barista who used to see us come in together on Saturday mornings, my mechanic who looked at me one day and said, "You're looking lighter, man," without realizing exactly how right he was about that assessment. I never gave anyone the full story. Not because I wanted to protect her reputation or maintain some misguided sense of loyalty to the woman who had betrayed me, but because the details didn't belong to anyone else. The story was mine now, and I didn't want the pity or the raised eyebrows or the slow, sympathetic head shakes that inevitably followed when people heard about infidelity and divorce. Honestly, I didn't want people feeling sorry for me anymore because I had stopped feeling sorry for myself. The truth was, I wasn't sorry about how things had ended. There was a strange kind of grief that comes with surviving someone you used to love. Not missing them exactly, but missing the idea of what you thought you had. Missing the person they had pretended to be during the good times. But even that grief faded eventually. The pain grew smaller over time, like a scar you gradually stop noticing until one day you realize it's been weeks since you thought about it at all. I got a new phone number and deleted all the photos that contained memories of our life together. I changed my daily routines, stopped going to the places we used to frequent, and quit listening to the playlists that reminded me of those late-night drives when she would rest her hand on my knee and I thought we were building something lasting. I started drinking my coffee black instead of the way she had always prepared it for me. I wrote a list of things I wanted to do and places I wanted to visit. Goals that had nothing to do with anyone else's expectations or desires, dreams that belonged entirely to me. For the first time in years, I was making decisions based solely on what I wanted, not on what would keep peace in a relationship that had been dying for longer than I cared to admit. One morning, I received a text message from an unknown number. "Hope you're doing okay," it read. "Just wanted to check in." I knew immediately that it was her. That wasn't even a question. The tone, the phrasing, the calculated casualness of it all screamed Brianna. But this wasn't genuine concern for my well-being. This was bait, pure and simple, another attempt to reel me back into some form of contact that she could then manipulate to her advantage. I blocked the number without responding. Not out of anger or spite, but out of respect for myself and the peace I had worked so hard to build. Because I had already seen who she truly was when things got difficult, when she had to choose between personal comfort and honoring her commitments. She hadn't stumbled or made a mistake in a moment of weakness. She had leaped deliberately toward what she wanted, leaving me to deal with the wreckage. I was done providing her with a soft place to land whenever she felt like testing the waters. It's strange how the world keeps moving forward, even when your personal universe caves in around you. I remember the day the final paperwork arrived in my mailbox. Just a quiet, unremarkable envelope with no drama attached to it. No fanfare to mark the official end of what had once been the most important relationship in my life. Just a legal stamp that meant it was finished, documented, and filed away in some government office where our marriage had become nothing more than a statistic. I held that envelope in my hands for a full minute before opening it. Not because I was shaking or angry, but because I wanted to acknowledge the moment properly. Then I opened it, reviewed the documents that declared us legally, officially divorced, and experienced something I hadn't expected at all: relief. Not the celebratory kind that you might shout about or share with friends, but the quiet, profound kind that settles over you like a warm blanket on a cold night. It was the relief of setting down a weight you had forgotten you were carrying. The relief of finally being able to breathe without having to monitor someone else's emotional weather patterns. The relief of knowing that you would never again have to question your own perceptions or wonder if you were being unreasonable for expecting basic honesty from the person who claimed to love you most. The lessons came later, not packaged neatly like some inspirational revelation you might read in a self-help book, but slowly unfolding over time in ways that were sometimes brutal, but always honest. Here's what I learned the hard way through this experience. Love isn't measured by grand gestures or perfect social media posts. It's not about the expensive vacations or the carefully curated photos that make other people envious of your relationship. Real love lives in the quiet moments. The ordinary Tuesday mornings when there's nothing special happening, the consistency of showing up day after day even when it's boring or difficult. It's in the small, unremarkable acts of consideration that nobody else ever sees or celebrates. When someone stops showing up in those small ways, When they stop being present during the mundane moments that actually make up most of a relationship, they've already started leaving. The grand exit, the dramatic affair, the official breakup, those are just the final paperwork for a departure that began long before anyone admitted it out loud. Trust doesn't shatter in a single catastrophic moment, despite how it might feel when you discover the betrayal. Trust erodes slowly, gradually, through 1,000 tiny compromises and half-truths that you might not even notice at the time. And when trust is finally gone completely, it takes a fundamental part of you with it. Not necessarily forever, but that part never comes back in exactly the same shape it was before. Forgiveness, I learned, is not about letting someone back into your life or pretending that their actions didn't devastate you. Sometimes forgiveness is simply about letting yourself move forward without carrying the poison of their choices in your bloodstream. It's about refusing to let their betrayal define your future relationships or your capacity for trust and vulnerability. And strength, real strength, isn't about fighting for something that's already dead. It's not about grand gestures or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is walk away when everything inside you wants to fix what cannot be fixed, when every instinct screams at you to try harder, to find the magic words that will make someone care about you the way you deserve to be cared for. Strength is letting the silence speak louder than begging. It's closing the door firmly without slamming it, walking away with your dignity intact, even when your heart is shattered into pieces. It's choosing yourself consistently, even when that choice feels impossible. If you're reading this and you've been lied to, cheated on, manipulated, or made to question your own worth and sanity, I need you to hear this. You are not crazy. Your feelings are valid, your pain is real, and your desire for honesty and loyalty is not asking for too much. You are not weak for trusting someone who proved themselves untrustworthy, and you are not alone in this experience, even when it feels like the most isolating thing that has ever happened to you. You don't need them to admit what they did was wrong. You don't need them to show remorse or regret for the pain they caused you. You don't need their validation of your experience or their acknowledgement that you deserved better treatment. What you need, the only thing you actually need, is to walk away from the situation with your self-respect intact. Walk without looking back, without checking to see if they're watching, without hoping they'll chase after you with the apology you've been waiting for. Walk because you deserve better than what they were willing to give you. And walk because staying would only teach them that their behavior has no real consequences. Because someday, maybe not today, maybe not next week, maybe not even next month, you'll feel air in your lungs again that doesn't taste like guilt or self-doubt. You'll wake up in the morning without that immediate crushing weight in your chest that reminds you of everything you've lost. You'll laugh without instinctively checking to see if they're watching or judging your happiness. You'll go entire days without thinking about them at all. And when you do remember them, it won't feel like a knife twisting in your chest. It will just be a memory of something that happened to you once, something that shaped you but doesn't define you anymore. You'll be free. And freedom, real, genuine freedom, doesn't come from getting closure from the person who hurt you. It doesn't come from hearing them admit they were wrong or seeing them suffer consequences for their actions. Freedom comes from choosing yourself every single day, from rebuilding your life around your own values and desires rather than around the absence of someone who proved they didn't deserve to be there in the first place. Freedom comes from recognizing that you are complete without them, that your worth was never dependent on their ability to see it or appreciate it. Freedom is waking up one morning and realizing that you're genuinely grateful for the experience, not because you enjoyed the pain, but because it taught you things about yourself and about love that you couldn't have learned any other way. That's where I am now. Not bitter, not broken, not waiting for karma to catch up with her or hoping she'll realize what she lost. I'm free, and that freedom is worth more than any apology she could offer or any relationship we could have tried to rebuild from the ashes of her betrayal. The story doesn't end with revenge or dramatic justice. It ends with peace, with clarity, with the quiet satisfaction of knowing that I chose dignity over desperation, self-respect over self-pity. It ends with me building a new life that belongs entirely to me, filled with people who know how to love honestly and consistently. And honestly, that's the best possible ending I could have asked for.